What I've done here is I've stacked up the consumption-led economies in the world today. This is all of them. And this is what they'll look, assuming 0% economic growth, which I realize is not realistic. We've got to start somewhere. Here's where they will be in 2030. Here's the world's export-led systems. They're aging out. They disappear as a class. Now, today, we only have one post-growth economy. That's Japan. They've already aged into mass retirement. But if you fast forward 10 years and look at the demographics, folks, this is already over. Consumption has already peaked. Production is peaking right now. Global capital supplies peak this year. None of them will return in our lifetime. You want to grow some more 40-year-olds? It takes 40 years. And all of this was before coronavirus. Coronavirus has driven all the consumption-led systems offline and into recession at the same time. So if you're an exporting nation, it really doesn't matter if you can beat the virus because you have no one to sell to. Let's look at the comparison that everyone in India loves to make. Now here we've got India and China in the year 2000. But as we all know, the Chinese have a one-child policy. So you fast forward that today, and China has now the world's fastest aging demography. Best case scenario, assuming nothing else goes wrong, in the year 2100, there'll be fewer than half as many Chinese as there are today. Calendar year 2020, the Chinese birth rate collapsed, dropped by almost a quarter. Remember, it takes 9 months to have a kid. That means the birth rate in 2020 reflected 2019 conditions. They haven't had their coronavirus crash yet. Now look at India today. It's aging too. India might be resistant to deglobalization, but it's urbanized right alongside everyone else. India's birth rate began to contract 25 years ago, and that contraction sharply accelerated a decade ago. That means India in 2021 is aging at a similar rate to what China aged at back in 1980. That would suggest, in the worst case scenario, India still has 40 years of demographic dividends to reap. That's great. So that's our second big point. India faces little of the demographic pressure that plagues not just China, but most of the world. Now, that doesn't mean that there are no clouds in these silver linings. India has the world's worst sex imbalance. In 2030, there will be 50 million surplus men under 45, concentrated in the Hindu belt. That is a social and a political stability issue. If Indian women today think that there's issues in Indian gender relations now, I mean, look out. In consumption-based systems, having half your population exist is, in essence, a lower caste, has implications for technological progress, investment capacity, and, of course, consumption. Let me put that into a little bit more context. On the left, we are looking at population density. On the right, we're looking at per capita income. So on the left, the red and the orange are the particularly densely populated regions, while blue and green are less dense. On the right, the red and orange are the poorer regions, while the blue and green are the wealthier ones in per capita terms. There's a moderately strong correlation between population density and personal economic performance, particularly in the Hindu belt. Now, I'm not telling you anything that you haven't heard before here. For India, this contest between population and prosperity has always been an issue. My point is that in a world in which global capital supplies are about to collapse, this disconnect is going to sharpen. It will not go away. But at least it's a problem that is a familiar one. It isn't like India is going to be struggling with the collapse of a trade-based model or a consumption-based model or an export-based model or a capital-intensive model. The problems India will have are the problems India already knows. You have methods for dealing with them. They're not perfect, but at least your basic understanding of your domestic economy is not going to change. It's the devil you know. The devil China knows is a disaster. I can give a presentation for 3 hours about how China is going to be a failed state and not exist in a decade, but this is really the one that matters the most. It's the islands off the coast, Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, Indonesia. The Chinese call it the first island chain, and there is no period in the long history of the Han people in which China has been able to economically interact with the lands beyond the chain ever, except right now, under the American-led order. Because the basic tenet of the order is that the Americans forced everyone to be on the same side and no one interferes with anyone else's economic trade. If the Americans leave, that ends. China is only successful because the Americans are enabling it to be, but the Americans are getting out of that business. Now There are two countries that theoretically could take America's place and enable China's future success, and they are Japan and India. What we've got here is a map that shows all the energy flows that go into China. 80% of China's oil is imported, 85% of that flows by India. Now, Japan's navy is fully blue water, so it can interdict shipping to and from China nearly anywhere. Japan's navy has the range to reach the Persian Gulf, where most of this crude comes from. But what Japan cannot do is reach the Gulf if the path is hostile, and that is where India comes in. Not only can India reach the Gulf by itself now, India can interdict anyone attempting to approach the Gulf from the east. So that's the third big point. No one in East Asia can access the Persian Gulf without India's express sign-off. India is the most important country in determining whether China will survive the next few decades. It's entirely up to you. And this all might be happening sooner than you think. First of all, we are likely to have an energy crisis in the next few months. Now, you may remember back during the Obama administration, the Americans and the Iranians cut a deal where Iran would cancel its nuclear program if in exchange it was rehabilitated. There were a lot of Americans who thought that deal was bad. Trump was one of them. And Donald Trump canceled the deal and applied a maximum pressure campaign to destroy the Iranian economy, which has been broadly successful. Now, under the new president, Biden, the talk is whether or not that deal is going to be revised. It's not, because the circumstances have changed. The Iranians are kind of over a barrel right now, and the Americans, if there is going to be a new deal, they want a much stricter one that restricts Iranian policies. To that end, the Iranians realize they don't have anything to trade, so they've gone out to try to establish new chits. So, around New Year's, they started hijacking ships in the Gulf, specifically a South Korean chemicals tanker, thinking that that would get the Americans' attention. It didn't. Trump did nothing. Biden did nothing. We don't care. Because of the shale revolution, we don't care about global energy markets. So expect the Iranians to kind of up the ante and grab bigger and bigger ships in order to get people's attention. That obviously has consequences for energy shipments. Second, the Americans have had a sharp falling out with the Russians over everything from cyber crime to cyber stalking to election interference to general propaganda. But because the Americans don't care about energy anymore, the Americans are preparing a series of sanctions against Russian energy exports. So now, all of a sudden, we have a potential for an energy crisis both in the Persian Gulf and in the former Soviet space. And losing trans-Suez shipments this week has certainly not helped. This can all blow up very quickly, and the Americans are not going to be a guarantor of energy shipments. If anything, they're going